Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. In today's talk, our second conversation with philosopher Raymond Geuss, we delve into a highly ambitious topic, the exploration of the big picture. Raymond Geuss is a political philosopher renowned for his contributions to 19th and 20th century European philosophy. Raymond is now Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Cambridge. His research spans a multitude of topics, from aesthetics, Nietzsche, contextualism, phenomenology, to intellectual history, culture, and ancient philosophy. Raymond, thank you for joining me again today and for your willingness to engage with this grand endeavor of understanding the big picture.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Also joining our quest for answers is Michael Hampe, Professor for Philosophy at ETH Zurich and initiator of the Metis project. Thank you, Mr. Hampe, for being here today.
Thank you, Eliane.
In Plato's Timaeus, the protagonist and name-giver of the dialogue gives a lecture about the cosmos. In it, the entire universe is presented and humankind's place in it is described. It is a comprehensive picture of the world in which we live that, along with Christian ideas, has significantly influenced ways of thinking in Europe. Naturally, I would claim, people try to orient themselves in the world they inhabit, in the life they are living. So it makes sense to want to try and grasp a picture of the entire thing. So we try to see the large and small connections, so we can somehow maneuver ourselves through life in a sensible, smart, or meaningful way. To begin with, I would like to ask you, Raymond, about your assessment of whether this is a kind of standard procedure of Western thinking. Do we, here in Europe, for example, have a tendency to hold on to grand stories that we can use as a base from which we can then make sense of our own lives and go deeper into what we perceive as our own intricacies of our personal lives?
May I start by saying something about the concept of having a big picture? What does it mean to have a big picture? What sort of conception is that? And I think if you think of it, you can see that there are actually, it seems to me, three different things that tend to be identified in that idea of having a big picture. That is, there are three separate strands, and the strands are analytically very different. And in a way, the idea of having a big picture is the idea of putting all those three strands together in a coherent way. So what are the three strands then? I think the first strand is the idea that a big picture is something like a map. It's something like a map of the world. It's something like an account of the world. That is, it's something like a theory in natural science. In natural science, we have small pictures, we have larger pictures, we have big pictures. And so we can have a picture of how things work here in this house. We can have a picture of how things work in Europe. We can have a picture of how things work in the cosmos. And you get more and more encompassing pictures of the world. And we have a speculative tendency, I think, to try to want to have bigger and bigger, more and more comprehensive pictures of things. And that's a speculative interest, which is perfectly legitimate and which finds, in a way, its ultimate realization in natural science. You know, the natural scientists want to get big picture in that sense. Stephen Hawking once said he wanted to get a theory of everything, having a theory of everything. So there's one dimension, which is a kind of cognitive, speculative, theoretical, scientific aspect. And speculation should be free. And of course it should be free. And we should try to get as all-encompassing a view, a picture of the world as we can, and we want to get it. And we know in the philosophical tradition how to approach that, more or less. We look for one that's big, we look for one that's consistent, we look for one that's supported, observationally supported, theoretically supported, various ways. That's one aspect. Speculation, cognition, epistemology, science. But there's another dimension which is not exactly the same as that, which is a rather pragmatic orientation. That is, I don't just want to know speculatively what the world as a whole looks like. I want to know what to do. And when I want to know what to do, very often I want to know what to do in a particular circumstance, in a very, very particular situation in which I find myself. And of course, you can say that you can, that there's a direct connection between the big speculative pictures you have and the actual imperatives you're given or the advice you're given for acting in this particular situation. You can say there is a connection between them, but the connection may be very, very, very long. There may need to be a huge chain of argumentation from Stephen Hawking's theory of the cosmos as a whole to what I should eat for breakfast today. What I really want, in a way, is I want the speculation, but I also want direction, or at least advice. And traditionally, people have confused those two things and thought you can only have direct, pragmatic advice that's reliable if you have it connected to the big picture. That is a speculative claim. That's not an obvious thing. So there's this speculative desire that we have for cognitive understanding of the universe. There's the practical imperatives we have of getting out of the way when lightning strikes or not being run over by the car. That's a second dimension. But there's a third dimension, which is what you might call the dimension of identity. So there's a dimension of speculation, there's a dimension of pragmatics, and there's a dimension of who am I? And here I would appeal to this thought that you find in the French philosopher Althusser. He says, what worldviews do, a worldview isn't just a big theory. A worldview is a theory which engages in this action which he calls interpellation. There isn't any word for that in English, really. I don't actually know whether there's a word for it in German. But if I understand the term correctly, interpellation means I call you by your name. I identify you. I say to you what you are. And it's connected often with police context. Man muss sich ausweisen, in German. The police comes to you and you have to show your identification. You have to show who you are. You have to say who you are. And so there's a dimension of the theory telling you who you are and asking you to accept the identity that it gives you. So Christianity says to you, you're a child of God. That's what you are essentially. And you have to identify with that. And so I think that is a different dimension from the dimension of pragmatics and from the speculative dimension. And the idea that's taken hold in Europe is that those three things should be integrated. You should have a big theory, a scientific theory of the whole. It should be connected to how you should act, and it should give you your identity, tell you who you are. And I'm not saying that that's impossible. I'm just saying you should be skeptical and see that is an aspiration. That is not an obvious thing. That's not a Selbstverständlichkeit. It's not something that goes without saying.
Yeah, I have a terminological question concerning what picture means in this context. I've read a book by René Braque, a French historian who studied the ancient cultures in the Middle East. And if I remember him right, he says there are some cultures who have in their language an equivalent for the term world. And there are some cultures who just talk about the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the mountains, the rivers, but they never use a term that collects all these, let's say, entities together as the world. And there is another philosopher, Paul Feyerabend, who says in more or less in all of his books since Against Method that Parmenides was an evil philosopher, so to say, because he invented the term being, an abstract term. So Feyerabend seems to suggest that if you use very abstract and general terms like world and being, you somehow lose the connections for your concrete action, for what you call the second picture. If you want to orientate yourself when, say, to harvest something or when to cut the fur of the sheep, you have to know the calendar exactly. But you don't have to have a theory of the world for that. You have to know when the sun is where and when the moon is there and so on. So you need a concrete knowledge of cosmic events in order to orient yourself as an agricultural person, so to say. But what Feyerabend seemed to say is somehow we went mad by thinking there is a theory of totality, which is not just a theory of the moon, the sun or so, or even a theory of being. So what do you think about this idea that pictures can be more or less abstract or more or less concrete, that they can be just an aggregation of what we find in the heavens and on the earth, and that they can be, like Hawkins, just a formula where you not even know, if you are not a mathematician, what the formula is about?
Yes, that's of course the one of the most important questions. Growing up as I did, I grew up reading Heidegger, and as you know, there's a famous essay by Heidegger in Holzwege called Die Zeit des Weltbildes, in which he says it's only at a particular time in Western history that people begin to have the idea that there could be a picture of the world. And the pre-Socratics didn't necessarily have a picture of the world. The idea that you could have a single picture of the world is an achievement. It's not something we can. And similarly, as you know, people have often talked about who is the first person to use the term cosmos. As you know, in Homer, cosmos refers to the ornaments that are used on horses and things, horse equipment. So when does the idea that cosmos doesn't just, or eukosmetes, the beginning, the well-ordered, the well-ordered troops. So it means well-ordered thing, beautiful thing. And when do you think that there is such a thing as the whole universe and it forms a well-ordered, beautiful sort of thing? Rather, we should think that the world is just, as they say, one damned thing after another.
Yeah, so I could ask not only the question you put to us in one of your recent books, who needs a worldview, but also who needs the concept of world? Why do people need a concept of cosmos? Is there an answer to this question?
I think there is. I think there is an answer to that question, but it's an answer to that question which depends. Philosophers will hate this. It depends on sociology and history. The answer is, if you're living in an agricultural society, and what you need to do, as you said, is to learn to plow. You learn you plow in May, you learn you harvest in, and you have a series of, and you don't have to think about the further consequences of what you do. I think we're not living in a society in which that detached way of thinking is natural for us anymore. I would think with Foucault, Foucault talks about the way in which practices in our society have caused us to think of ourselves as individuals. Well, it's also the case that practices in our society have caused us to think about the consequences of things. And once you begin to think about the consequences of things, there's no obvious end to that. Now, may I just say one more thing about this? So my view is that there is a kind of pragmatic naturalness to getting beyond that. Now I'm going to say something that's very, very contentious, I know, and perhaps it's wrong, but I mean, I'm at the end of my life. What will happen to me if I say something that's wrong? I was always taught that Gödel had actually, the right way to interpret Gödel was that you couldn't have a theory of everything. That if Gödel was right, Stephen Hawking was wrong, because Gödel shows that you cannot have a theory for elementary arithmetic that is consistent and coherent if you allow it to satisfy certain further specifications. Now, if you can't have a theory even of elementary arithmetic that is consistent and coherent, a fortiori, you're never going to get a theory of the world as a whole that is coherent and consistent. Now, that was the line that was always taught to me when I was an undergraduate, that the idea that you could get a single, unitary, consistent view of the world was a human aspiration that we had, and it arose out of various reasons, sociological and historical reasons. But we could also see, and Gödel had shown, that that was an aspiration we needed to treat with great, great suspicion and great, great skepticism. And therefore, it was better to think about these things pragmatically.
Maybe I can jump in here and actually ask, because you talked about cosmos, world. Now, if you think about nowadays, which you also alluded to, there's often talk of universal structures. So universal rights that we want to talk about, things that all the different countries and the different continents should agree on. And this in itself seems like quite the endeavor also. And I wanted to ask you maybe if you could explain a bit more what this universal concept, maybe in terms of worldviews, also means nowadays.
Yes, of course, that is one of the main problems of contemporary politics. And there, I would say, too, we think of truths as things that are out there to be found. Vérité à trouver. They're there, up there, and we find them. And so is there a truth, which is that there are universal values, or is there no truth? And I would tend to say, well, one shouldn't orient oneself in these things around the idea of a vérité à trouver. One should think of it as a vérité à faire. That is, we have universal values. If that's a constructive task we might set ourselves. We have universal values if we can create the institutions in our world which will support certain kinds of agreement. There's absolutely no guarantee that we will be able to do that. The idea that there are or are not universal values out there, the point of that, I take it, is to give us a guarantee. If those universal facts are out there, we can find them. We can get agreement on them. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think we've got consensus. We have the consensus we have. We have good reasons in many cases, not in all cases, to seek consensus. We don't seek consensus with everyone. We didn't seek consensus with Hitler. That's not appropriate. It's not appropriate always to seek consensus. That's a contextual matter. And if you seek consensus, it's also an open question whether or not you will find it. And it's a question that depends on wider social structures. So I'm afraid on that, I'm rather of the opinion, no, there aren't universal values in the sense in which that's intended, but it doesn't follow from that we should give up the attempt to construct what we can to make a peaceful world in which people don't kill each other.
But isn't one problem in this search for universal or global values that people on different parts of the globe have different conceptions of what they are themselves, relating to the third thread, the third path you just mentioned at the beginning, that Christians in the West, let's say, might consider themselves as being images of God, of having an immortal soul, whereas Buddhists in Asia might say there is no soul, the self is just a social construction. We are not image of a personal goddess, and people who live in so-called animistic cultures might believe that trees and rivers have a soul and that humans are not special in that. And if you bargain about possible global values, these different self-conceptions will come in as well. So wouldn't we need something like a global self-understanding of what a human being is in order to start this debate of global values?
If that is the case, then I think we're doomed, because I think that we're not going to have that. We don't have a global conception of what the human being is that we can use as a basis for doing these things. All we have is what we have. All we have is people with preferences, people with conceptions of their identity, people who stand under pragmatic necessity. We have the best bit of knowledge we can get, but the knowledge is fallible. It's absolutely important to remember that we do not have, that is something that I do think is true. I think one of the things that we do know is that the Christian cannot have absolute secure knowledge about the nature of Christian belief. But of course, a lot of Christians would say that too. Kierkegaard would say it's part of being a Christian that you don't know whether your faith is. It's not faith. It's not faith if it's, in a way, it's not faith if it's certain. If you know it, if it has the saliency of seeing something directly in front of your face, it's not faith. It's observation. Faith has a different structure. So it is true, I suppose, that my attitude depends on assuming that we have no access to an absolutely infallible, fundamentum inconcussum or belief. And that's right. You're right.
Yeah, what I meant is that these self-images are in a strange and difficult to understand way intermingled with, mixed with values that you believe you might not be allowed to pollute the river because the river is inhabited by a holy creature. You might not be allowed to cut this tree because this tree is a holy tree, whereas the other tree is not a holy tree. So these spiritual conceptions which humans might have about themselves and other creatures are somehow related to the values they follow in their actions. So I did not necessarily mean that you needed a global anthropology, so to say, to start from in order to develop global values, but that when you talk about global values, you also have to talk about these self-understandings because they are mixed with these values, no?
Absolutely. When I said there are these three dimensions, I mean that they are analytically distinct. They don't automatically go together, but of course, in most concrete cases, they will be connected. The Christian thinks of himself or herself in a certain way because he or she has been called by Jesus, has an identity, an essential identity. The Christian also thinks that implies certain ways of acting, which are necessary and are not merely facultative, not just optional. And the Christian also will be associated with some limits on the kind of world view you have. A Christian can't easily be a Lucretius, someone who believes in the world of a Lucretius, where atoms just come into existence and move at random, etc. So you're absolutely right. To understand a human being and to understand a culture is, of course, to see the particular configuration of those three different dimensions that constitutes how those people live in the world, what they think about the world, which may be more general or less general, more consistent, less consistent, more detailed, less detailed, more speculative, less speculative, how they act in the world, what advice they take, what normative conceptions they have, and how they think about themselves. And all three of those things will be connected in any particular case. But I think it's important to see that there'll always be the possibility of a certain kind of free play in that. The philosophical idea that we get from Plato is there should be monolithic. We should have a complete coherence of all of those things. We know what the world is. We know what we should do. We know what our identity is. Schön wäre es, would be very nice. That's not the way the world actually operates. And so I think one has to be aware, as I think you're saying, both of the analytical distinction between these things, the room there is for flexibility between them, and yet the attempt that people make to put them together and the ways in which in particular cultures they are connected.
I would like to jump in here now because you talked a lot about Christianity. And I would like to dig a little deeper there because once, I think in one of your books, you wrote that one of your teachers said that there are only actually two worldviews, Catholicism and Marxism. And now you also wrote a book about liberalism. And I would maybe even argue that liberalism has a really strong impact on our world nowadays. It's not actually called a worldview now, but I would still like to know how you would put that in this whole discussion, as I mean, it is used to make large connections and it is used to make justifications. So maybe if you could talk about liberalism versus worldview and what this all means.
As you know, liberalism starts as a very concrete political program. It's first used in Spain at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century to designate a political party which is in favor of introducing limited monarchy into Spain. So it has a concrete, small-scale program, political program. It isn't a worldview at all. It's a particular program. It says, no, the Spanish monarchy is not absolute. It should be like the British monarchy. It should be limited. There should be a constitution. It should be a Rechtsstaat in some way. Now, so something can be a political program and it can turn into a worldview. And I think that is the development that I observed during my lifetime. Until basically World War II, liberalism was a particular kind of political program, and it had very peculiar properties. It was deeply anti-Kantian, for instance. I mean, the idea that liberalism and Kant have something in common is an invention of Rawls. Not an invention. It's a discovery or invention. I mean, before Rawls, liberalism was anti-Kantian because Kant believes in fixed structures of the mind and absolute imperatives. And the liberal doesn't believe in that. So Benjamin Constant argues against Kant about lying. So liberalism starts as this inchoate thing. There are some discussions, theoretical discussions about toleration in Locke, and there are particular political programs. That's not a worldview yet. Historically, then, these develop. And then at the end of World War II, the Allies are looking around for some general way of describing what it is that they have in common and distinguishes them from the Axis. And now it can't be republicanism because Britain has an empire, right? You couldn't say the fascists were not democratic, they were not republics, because Britain isn't a republic. Britain wasn't a republic, it was an empire with a king. So they thought, no, instead of that, we'll call it liberal. So we're a liberal empire, a liberal monarchy, a liberal republic in the United States. And then after the Second World War, this thing which started as a combination of some theoretical things about toleration in Locke and some religious thinkers and a particular political program gets put together, and people then gradually in the 70s begin to say, no, it's a worldview. It's a way of thinking about yourself. And Dewey says, for example, There's a similar thing with democracy. As you know, democracy is a dirty word in political conversation until the 20th century. No one wants to be a Democrat. And Dewey says, no, we should be Democrats. And democracy is not a political structure, it's a social structure. So the same thing happens with liberalism. Liberalism starts as a series of relatively clear value commitments to toleration for everybody who's not. Toleration, Locke says, for everybody who's not a Catholic, a Quaker, or an atheist should be tolerated. So you start with these particular relatively limited thoughts. Then you have political orientation on constitutional monarchy that's limited. And that gradually, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, gets connected with democracy. And then after the Second World War, you get it put forward as a general framework. And then gradually it gets more and more and more. It accumulates more and more. But as it does that, it loses its shape. It becomes informe, lacking in distinction. So it can become universal by virtue of everybody's a liberal now, except me. But if everybody's a liberal except me, then what is it? And then everybody says to me, Raymond, you're really a liberal. How could you not be? Look, you're an instance of liberalism. Well, I spent my whole life saying, no, I'm not. And they keep saying to me, no, you have to be. Once you've got that, then you have a violation of Popper's claim. There's no way you can refute. Popper says it's not a proper theory if you can't refute it. And we're now in a situation in which we can't really refute being a liberal because I spend my life screaming that I'm not one, and they still tell me I am one. I'm sorry, excuse me.
But why should you be one?
Exactly. Sorry, I will say one more thing. I'm sorry to repeat myself. I just wrote this book. Liberalism has no monopoly on many of the virtues that it claims for itself. The virtue of toleration was around before liberals ever got their hands on it. The Edict of Nantes is not a document that represents liberalism. And opposition to cruelty is there in Seneca, in the ancient world. Buddhism has clear conceptions of the necessity for compassion for people. Liberals say, we're the only ones who can ensure toleration, peacefulness, a lack of violence, lack of cruelty. Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with that. I think you can be a person who is in favor of the greatest possible toleration of people. You can be against cruelty. You can be in favor of talking to people. I don't think that dialogue is a bad thing. I just think it's not an Allheilmittel, it's not a panacea. You can't solve everything with dialogue. Now, so I would say, if you're thinking about liberalism, please be historical a little bit and be anthropological and see that many of the things liberals believe in are very, very good. It's good not to torture people for no reason. It's very good. But that in itself thinking that it's bad to be cruel doesn't make you a liberal. It just makes you human.
I have a very superficial knowledge of the history of liberalism, but to my understanding, liberalism as a worldview is also connected with the idea of individuals having a free choice on a market, and that you should somehow accept the free will of individuals. And it seems to me that this idea of individuals having a free will, if it is part of liberalism, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, develops in a culture that is constantly denying the fact of free will. So you have a scientific or scientistic culture that says we do not find any free will in the brain, we do not find any free will in the social determination of human development. So free will is just a fiction of some philosophers. But at the same time, it seems to me that the market part of liberalism presupposes a self-understanding that we have a free will. So isn't the worldview of liberalism flawed at this point?
I think there are three essential things about liberalism, and then there's a fourth one which is problematic. One is, you're absolutely right. It's associated with a certain sense of the sovereignty of the individual. The individual is a person who knows his or her own mind and can freely decide, and is an informed person, and who knows what he or she wants and can act on that. That's central to liberalism. Second, liberalism is a theory about the power of discussion and the preferability of discussion over other more forceful ways of dealing with the world. And third, liberalism is associated with a certain set of virtues, toleration, etc. They're the three things that are absolutely central for liberalism. Then there's a fourth one, and there with the fourth one, I'm on your side of this, but I will simply announce that there is a large discussion about whether liberalism is or is not connected with the notion of the free market and the capitalist market. I myself think it is. I think it doesn't make sense without that. But I'm greeted with howls of execration when I say that, because then people say, oh no, you've confused liberalism with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a theory of the free market. Liberalism is not the theory of the free market. I think that's not convincing for a number of reasons, but that's a long discussion to go into. But if I can try to focus on what I think is behind your question, I think you're right. It's hard to see liberalism as a worldview surviving either being a Buddhist and not thinking you have a self at all, a fortiori then no free will. It's hard to survive sociological views about the fact that the informed consumer never exists. And in fact, most of the beliefs I have, I've acquired from other people on the basis not of investigating them at all. Most of my knowledge about myself is limited. My knowledge about goods, I'm supposed to buy different goods. I don't have the time to investigate which of them is better. The idea that I'm the knowledgeable, informed consumer in the marketplace, and I can exercise my free choice to pick that which is best for me, that rests on a series of sociological assumptions which are simply implausible. And then the third possibility is the one you mentioned, which is the scientific approach, which says, well, if you look for free will, you're not going to find it anywhere. I would point out also, just to break a lance for my best friend, now deceased, Michael Frede, was a scholar of the ancient world, and he wrote a book in which he tried to show that the concept of the will is invented by the Stoics. That doesn't mean that before the Stoics, people didn't know that I wanted something, but that there's a step from saying, I want this, I don't want that, to the idea that there is a faculty, which is the faculty of the will, which is exercised when I want something. What he says is, if you look at this, it's really the Stoics it's well known there's no word for the will in Aristotle. He says, I want this, I want that. I decide that prohairesis is not the will, it's choice. And in fact, generations of Oxford philosophers have misinterpreted Aristotle by actually projecting the discussion of the will back onto the Nicomachean ethics, where it's completely fehl am Platz. It's not right there. So historically, too, the Greeks, until the Stoics, got away with not having a will. They didn't need it. They didn't need to make that conceptualization. They could do everything they wanted to do by talking about individual people deciding on particular things in different ways. So if you think that the idea, and then of course, the idea of the free will gets, in my view, toxic through Christianity and Augustine. And Augustine then construes Christianity in terms of the will and the freedom of the will, and then you get the whole religious discussion of free will. You can dispense with all of that, in my view. You can actually go back and try to think about the world in a way that is more differentiated, and which you see the scientific facts about how we act, the social facts about how we act, the philosophical ways about how we act, and you can just dispense with some of these traditional fictions.
Now, it seems to me that all these things that you just explained and the different forms of worldviews that we just looked at now, this seems like an impossibility. If you want to have worldview together with something as a concept of free will, this seems impossible. And also nowadays, and I'm trying to make the link now to social media, I mean, you even call the people who you are following, you call it followers and influencers, which seems very problematic to me. And they're constantly, you're told that you have your own choices and we're supporting you to do your own choices. I'm just showing you ways to do it. This seems very much going to what you just explained, that there's very much a specific push into what you should think is a free will. What do you think?
I experience it in the political realm. What do you do if all the political parties offer you no choice on things that are important for you? During the war in Iraq, I, with 2 million other people, demonstrated in the streets in London, the biggest demonstration in British history. 2 million people. There were demonstrations in other places too. That had no effect. The Labour Party supported the war in Iraq and the Conservative Party supported the war in Iraq. What choice did I have? Which one should I vote for? That's the archetypical situation. The archetypical situation in the current world is choice between two things that are not actually different, or choice between things in which you have no way of telling which one is good and which one is bad. If I'm offered 25 different kinds of computer, I don't have a chance in hell of making an informed decision between them because they're all so complicated. I forget what the technical term is for it, but the amount of time and energy you would have to invest to inform yourself about one of these decisions, which computer to buy, stands all out of proportion to the actual value of the thing you're going to acquire. And while in one case it might be appropriate to do that, you can't lead your life like that. You can't lead your life going through the world, choosing things. The other example that I give is the National Health Service. As you know, we have a National Health Service here which treats everyone free. And the Tories are trying to introduce choice. You should have choice in your medical. I don't want choice. If I break my leg, I want someone competent I want someone competent to set my leg. I don't want to have a choice between different doctors. In medical circumstances, I want a general level of competence and I want reliability. The idea that I should have choice there just is a completely inappropriate thing. Or in education. The assumption of education is that the people who go in as pupils aren't yet informed. How can a child make an informed choice about education when the assumption is that the child only becomes educated at the end of the process? So if you begin thinking about the world in terms of this liberal idea that we're all consumers in the marketplace and we're informed consumers and we know what we want and we have knowledge, it does not represent social reality as I encounter it in any respect.
But perhaps what you just said might be a symptom of comprehensive worldviews in general, coming back to the Gödel problem, that in comprehensive worldviews, you expect that the self-image of the people who produce these worldviews are also part of the worldview. So that, let's think about a scientist, a neurologist who goes into the lab in order to show that brain activities are determined. If you talk to him and ask the brain scientist, are you entering the lab by your free will or are you determined in your research? Then the person will take the stance of free will by saying, I'm a free scientist, I pursue whatever I like, I have a choice about the experiments I do, and what happens inside the lab. Inside the lab, you show that the brain is determined and that you do not have a free choice. The same in sociology. You, as a sociologist, you decide what research you are interested in, what kind of investigations you do, but what you try to show is in what sense people are socially determined in their decisions. So there seems to be a contradiction appearing in worldviews each time you try to bring together the self-understanding of the person who produces a worldview and the worldview itself. So you want a sort of completeness that seems to be unattainable.
As you know, one of the things I'm keen to emphasize is that there is an aspect of theorizing that is underappreciated in philosophy, which is not just whether the theory in question is well supported, but what attitude I have toward the theory. That's another dimension, whether the theory is good, bad, or indifferent. What attitude do I have to it? Do I simply entertain it? Do I use it pragmatically? I may use it pragmatically. Do I think it's probably true? Or do I identify with it? Do I take it to be the sort of thing which isn't just a useful thing that I can use to make various sorts of things in the world, but it's something that gives me my identity. It has an interpellation to me. It tells me who I am, and I should, in fact, internalize the theory and use the theory completely to restructure my life around it and the way I understand myself. And it's that point at which something becomes a worldview, in my view. These speculative general things are not, in my view, worldviews. To come back to the Timaeus, Plato says in the Timaeus, I'm going to tell you an eikos mythos. I'm going to tell you a plausible myth, a likely story. A likely story is not something that tells me absolutely how I must reconfigure my personality. It's a likely story. And as you know, the sophists were experts in saying what is likely. What is eikos is a sophistic term about how the rhetorician should appeal to what is plausible to win a case. If there's one eikos mythos, there's another eikos mythos out there too. And I can use both of them, and I can use them different, but I can only use them if I maintain my Abstand, if I see that I am distinct from this. And I am very, very skeptical about the idea that this theory is more than simply a universal simplification apparatus for various sorts of things, and rather take it as something which talks to me and tells me who I really am. So I take it it's that last step, which is the step that's crucial for me, and where I say, this isn't scientific speculation. Scientific speculation should be free, but the scientific speculation becomes a worldview when you treat it like that. And you can only see that if you see that there's another dimension to it. It doesn't just have to be general. It's general and an interpellation to you that you respond to. May I just give one more example? Sorry. I'm not Jewish, but in New York, I was often invited to the Seder. And in the Seder, as you know, they tell the story about the oppression of the ancient children of Israel by the Egyptians and the children of Israel's liberation from that oppression. And you tell the story. And in the ritual, there's also an interesting part. There's a part that says, how can you misunderstand this story? And it says, the worst way of misunderstanding this story is to say, this is what happened to the Jews of old. This has nothing to do with me. That's ancient history. What that says is that the point of the story is not to have a true account. The point of the story is for the young person to identify with that story. That story that happened to them is what you are and what is happening to you. And it's that point at which you get a worldview. You get a worldview when the child doesn't just hear the story as one more eikos mythos or one aletes mythos. It can be true, it can be false, but where the story is your own story. And so in the Jewish ritual, you've missed the point if you don't see that connection and you don't make that connection, and it doesn't transform you into someone who understands himself as a child of Israel.
So we started this conversation trying to find the big picture and find out what the worldview is. But ultimately, I think what this all showed is that we're trying to find ways to identify ourselves. Also with the example that you just gave us now, and time is running out again. And so as a last question, I would like to ask to bring this all together also with the goal of the Metis project is that we're trying to always in all these talks also find a bit, how do we navigate through life, right? And so we're talking about identification, and I would like to ask you, how would you use different kinds of philosophy in this sense to help us navigate through this world full of worldviews? How can philosophy help us keep a clear head in a sense and try to figure out our own paths?
Philosophy, history, anthropology, they all have a role to play. We are living in a complex world in which we're under lots of imperatives, and we have a lot of ideological offers for us. Liberalism, nationalism, various sorts of things. And I think we have to learn as best we can to navigate our way through the world as we see it in the context of understanding the attractions and the limitations of these various offers and the ways in which they are compatible with each other, the ways in which they're not compatible with each other. And I think it's a very, very big mistake simply to identify oneself with one of them. One has to maintain a certain kind of distance. Now, people will say that's an artifact of my situation. And it is an artifact of my situation. I'm a very privileged old man here. I have a pension. I don't have to work. I can afford the luxury of being speculative and looking at this. But I think that this is the way in which many people in the world will increasingly have to think about themselves.
Does it mean that instead of having a worldview, you stay a skeptic?
You can have many. I see worldviews as a kind of Bereicherung. I think there's the life of the imagination and there's the life of action. And the life of action has clear imperatives. You get out of the way of the car or you don't get out of the way of the car. The imagination is free. Die Gedanken sind frei. Die Fantasie ist frei. World pictures are free. They can be enriching. It's like literature. You read literature, you learn things about yourself. You don't learn things about, I don't identify with Madame Bovary. I'm not a 19th century woman, but I learned something from that. And I can learn something from it without identifying with it in that sense. I have to identify with it in another sense. And that's what I think the study of worldviews can do. You can put yourself into the position imaginatively of someone who believes this, and you can do that while also not identifying yourself in a toxic way with them. And that would be the ideal for me, to get a rich inner life that's informed by the knowledge of these worldviews, by the historical knowledge of these worldviews, by the anthropological knowledge, sociological knowledge, and yet be able to get through life in a way.
This, I think, is a very good ending thought. So we should engage with our imaginations, engage with the world, and try to navigate through all this as best as possible, but staying critical, but also imaginative. I think this is a nice combination to hold on to. So at this point, I would like to thank you both for answering these difficult questions about big pictures and worldviews. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, I would also like to thank our listeners for joining us today and invite you to follow further Wisdom Talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. If there are any thoughts, insights, or ponderings that you would like to share with the Metis community, we encourage you to do so. You can find more information about this and about today's podcasts in the show note below. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münich and supported by ETH Zürich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.